I just finished up painting this portrait over the weekend, and in this week's video, I'm going to show you all the techniques that I used to paint it. I painted this one with much softer and smoother skin textures, which is not what I normally paint on this channel. I'm most often working on paintings like these two with a lot more dramatic lighting and skin textures. So we'll switch it up this week and do something a bit different. And like always, I'm going to start by painting in the eyes. So we're going to start with the left eye, which is in focus with some sharper details, and then move on to the right eye, which is slightly out of focus. It's a bit blurrier. Then we'll move on to the nose, the teeth, the lips to wrap up the first part of this one. That way we get all the major features of this portrait painted in all in one video. Here's my completed painting, which is monochrome, so it's all done in one color. This time I'm using Sepia by Schmincke Aero Colors, and here's a photo of my painting set to black and white, which might be a bit easier to see the values. The painting is 20 by 16 inches, it's done on claybord, and I'll put a crop section of my work on the left side of the screen for the part that we're going to be painting within this video. Like I mentioned, I'm using the color Sepia. I have it reduced about 50%, so about 2 parts of paint to 1 part distilled water. And I'm going to start here within the dark shadow within the iris and the pupil. I'm spraying right around 25 psi, and the first thing that I'm noticing is that there's a cast shadow within this eye from that upper eyelid. So the pupil and the iris are kind of blended together within some parts of that shadow, and there's a bright specular highlight along the left side. So the first thing that I want to do is start mapping in the placement of these dark values. You'll see that I sprayed some of that paint just above the specular highlight, and I'm going to extend some of this down along the right side. This way I'm going to get some separation between the whites of the eye and the upper eyelid where those eyelashes start. It's a softer edge, so I'm just painting it in freehand. I'm always trying to build up my values to slowly approach the final dark value. I don't want to get too dark right away. And I'm using sepia for this one, which you may find a bit easier to control the values than black, because that color can get very dark quickly. With sepia, it's going to take a few more layers to build up to a very dark value, which can be a lot more forgiving. There's a sharper edge along the bottom between the lower eyelid and the iris, so to paint that in, you'll see that I'm using a freehand shield, and this is one that I just made myself. It's a piece of copy paper that I cut a few curves in using an X-Acto blade, so it costs nothing to make and it works great. I'm looking for different parts of these curves to fit my drawing. I just line them up with the pencil lines and I spray a little bit of paint up into the eye. You can see when we do that, we get a very sharp edge here. Now this piece of paper does not fit the lower eyelid perfectly. It's not a stencil here, so I just line up little bits at a time, spray it in to get a continuous curve following my drawing. Once I get those contours or edges painted in, I'm going to start filling in the rest freehand. So I'll start within the pupil and just kind of expand some of this paint out to get into the iris. Now I don't want to lose the specular highlight within here, so I'm going to switch over to a soft eraser and start drawing in the shape of it. I'm just removing some paint here, making this area lighter. I'm also using this eraser to render out those very sharp edges along the outside of the highlight. And once I get this in, I'm going to switch over to the airbrush freehand, start painting in the left side of the eye. So that transition between the sclera and the upper eyelid, and also these really dark values along the left side of the eye. It almost gets pure black in here. So to get these layers darker and darker, it's just about spraying more paint. I'll use that piece of paper to mask off the lower eyelid, and you'll see that when I draw in this specular highlight with a more aggressive eraser, how much brighter it looks, and that's just because I have darker values surrounding it now. One thing that I like to do after I finish any part of a painting is to come around with my eraser like I'm doing here to clean up some overspray. I can also refine and sharpen up a few of these edges, and I find that this just helps keep everything clean and neat so I don't have more work to do later on. The next thing that I want to paint in here is the crease above the eye. Now it has a sharp edge, especially along the bottom, so I'm using a piece of paper that I cut a curve in using an X-Acto blade. You'll see that I line it up with my drawing, I spray some paint up. That gives me a sharp edge where I sprayed over the shield, and then I could spray some more layers on top to help darken everything. I'll just do that freehand. I'll use that same technique as I move along to the right, always following my pencil lines, and I'm going to switch off between a few different pieces of paper that I cut out with that blade. Again, they don't fit this crease perfectly, so I move them around to parts that do fit my drawing and then spray some paint in. That way I get a continuous line for the shadow in here. To the left of the eye, there's a few creases or wrinkles in here that have irregular edges. They're not perfectly straight, so my favorite tool for this is spraying over a ripped piece of paper. This way when I spray over it, the deckled edge texture gets transferred over to my panel, and it helps to give a bit of a natural look to these wrinkles, and these are just going to be the shadows for each one of them. Once I get a few of these shadows painted in, I'll start adding in the base of a few of the eyelashes along the upper eyelid, just along the left side here, and I'm doing it freehand. I can sharpen it up later with a few different tools. I'll paint in the creases below the eye using the same technique, and I'm adding these in before I have any paint down on this part of the panel. The reason that I like to do it this way is because right here I accidentally sprayed too much paint. This part of the crease got too dark. So what I'll do is make a light pass over it with a soft eraser, and this helps lighten down the values, and it also doesn't add any texture in the surrounding area since there's no paint down here. Then I'll continue using that technique for these 3 larger wrinkles below this, again using some pieces of paper that I cut out myself, and then over to the airbrush freehand to focus a little bit more of this sepia along the bottom part of each wrinkle. So each one of these has a transition from light on top, that's where the light's hitting it, to a mid-tone over to a shadow at the bottom. I also applied a light glaze of paint over this whole area so I have something to erase into, and then I'll use my soft eraser along the top of each one of these to pull out some light. I'll slow the video back down to real time so you can see the subtractive drawing technique that I'm using, and it's about starting on top where the brightest part of each highlight is. I use a little bit more pressure there, and as I work my way down into the mid-tone, I use less pressure on that eraser. I'm also trying to pay attention to some of the subtle patterns that I'm seeing as I draw this texture in as that light rounds over into shadow. I want to paint the base of a few more of these eyelashes in along the right side, so I'll do that with the airbrush freehand, and I'm using the same paint reduction here the entire time. It's about 50%. I'll continue to draw in a few more of these skin textures, and now there's this very thin highlight at the bottom of the eye, right between the transition of the lower eyelid and the eye above it. Because it's such a thin line, I'm going to use an X-Acto blade to scratch it out, just a light amount of pressure, and you'll see I'll draw this in. I get a very thin line there of pure white. I'm going to pull out a little bit of light within the sclera and the right side of the iris, so I'm using a soft eraser here with a light amount of pressure just to lift up some paint. And you can see that as long as I'm careful with my eraser, I can pull out highlights without adding any extra texture. So now that these creases in the skin is painted in underneath this eye, I want to add some texture in here. So the way I'm going to do this is by using an aggressive eraser. And what I'm doing here is tapping in a few dots, following the curves of a few of these highlights underneath the eye. And you'll see that it makes it look like some areas in here are raised up, catching some light, giving the illusion of a more natural skin texture. And this is only the first layer. We're going to push it much further later on. For this large crease to the left of the eye, I'm going to start by painting it in freehand, just mapping the placement of it, and then I'm going to continue glazing some of this sepia paint over the left side of the eye to help darken everything. I'm also glazing another light amount of paint along this lower eyelid, and then I'm going to go back to my eraser and add another layer of texture just like I showed before. When I'm working on any type of painting, I always like to work in layers like I'm doing here, just building up one after the next, always starting light, progressively getting darker and darker with each subsequent layer. So there's a few more wrinkles above the eye. I painted in the shadow of those, doing some freehand, some with some shields, depending on the edge. And I also glazed a light amount of this paint up above the eye, so I have something there to erase into later on. From here, let's move up to this eyebrow, and I'm going to start on the left side, and what I'm doing here is painting in a bunch of thin lines, almost parallel to one another, allowing some of them to overlap, getting some randomness in here. You'll see when I slow it down to real time that I'm moving the airbrush in these short strokes, and I'm spraying air the entire time here. All I'm doing is rocking the trigger backward and forward for each stroke. When I want to start a line, I pull back a little bit on the trigger. At the very end of each one, I push the trigger forward. This way I can paint in all these thin lines, and I can also vary the width. If I back up a little bit, they're going to be a bit wider and softer. If I move the airbrush a bit closer, they're going to be sharper. And because this is only the first layer of this hair, I'm not really concerned about the values within the eyebrow. I'm going to add those in later on. For now, it's just the underlaying layer of texture. So I'll go back to speeding some of this up because it's kind of boring to watch in real time, and you'll see that as I'm adding more layers here, I'm starting to add the values in. Like on the lower right hand side, I'm adding more paint to make it darker. And down in this area where it's a shadow, you can't see individual hairs anymore. It's more like a mass of a darker value. So I got that value in place nice and lightly like always. We're going to get darker later on with it, but for now what I'm going to do is use my eraser to start removing some paint here, and I'm not doing this for highlights. What I'm doing with my eraser is getting some separation in between these individual hairs. This way we have some sharper ones along the top. Then back over to the airbrush for another layer, darken up a few areas in here, and now for a few of these very sharp lines, especially along the right side and along the top, I'm going to use a graphite pencil. I'm using a 2H pencil, and I'm just drawing these in following the flow of the hair. They're a little bit wider at the base, and they get thinner as they move up and curve over to the left. And then at the bottom, I want a more natural transition between the hair and the skin texture below it, so I'm using a more aggressive eraser and just scratching out a few lines in here. This helps to break up that edge, give a little bit of randomness to it. Once that's done, I can use the airbrush, glaze some more paint on top to help darken this area up again. And at this point, I probably spent about 5, maybe 7 minutes on that eyebrow. And even with such a little amount of work, you can see that it's already starting to look natural. We could push this much further later on with some more work, some more layers of paint. There's a highlight just above the eye. It doesn't have too much texture, so I'm using a soft eraser with small circular motions to remove some paint in here, help lighten it up. Also on this upper eyelid, I want to pull out some more light in here as well. So again, using that soft eraser, pulling out some lines, a few dashes in here to make it look a little bit more random, a bit more naturalistic. And you'll see that while I'm doing this, I erase through some of the base layers of the eyelashes that I painted in before. It's not a big deal. After I finish the eye, I'll add the eyelashes in as a final part. Now, before going any further, I want to work with my eraser a little bit more and focus on pulling some highlights out above these shadows with these wrinkles and creases just to the left of the eye. And I'm doing this just like the ones that I did underneath the eye. I'm starting at the top, removing some more paint so we get a highlight up there and using less pressure as I work my way down. So we get highlight, mid-tone, shadow. Now, before going any further, I want to add some more definition to this eyebrow. So I'm going to use that aggressive eraser and get some separation in between some of the hairs within the center. And then I'm going to use a pencil and a black colored pencil to draw in a few lines on top here. This way we get some real definition for some of the darker hairs. And then once those are in, I'll use the airbrush to glaze a little bit of paint along the lower right-hand side of this eyebrow to help darken it up again. And then finally for the eyelashes, this is going to be very simple. I'm just going to draw them in using a graphite pencil and a black colored pencil. I start with a 2H pencil to draw in a thin line from the base all the way up to the top. I go a little bit wider at the bottom and I get thinner as it moves up. And I just focus on one eyelash at a time. Once one is in, then I'll switch over to the black colored pencil and fill in the base of it. That way I get a darker value and a bit wider at the bottom. And the video sped up, but in real time, I'm always working slowly, taking my time, one eyelash at a time, getting it in correctly. Once those are in, I'll draw in a few lines along the top part of the specular highlight so it looks like the eye is reflecting some of those eyelashes. And then I'll draw a few very light ones along that lower eyelid and also use an X-Acto blade to scratch out a few thin lines where I'm seeing them. And so that's it for the first layer of this eye. Everything is in place right now. I got everything where I want it to be. After I paint in the rest of the portrait and the surrounding skin textures, I'm going to come back to this eye and paint it in again. I'll show you that later on in the video. That's where all the corrections happen. But for now, what I want to do is move along to the right eye, which is going to be a little bit of a different technique because this eye is a little bit softer, a little bit more out of focus. I'm using the same paint, reduction, and PSI as before, and the way that I'm painting this in is by holding the airbrush a little bit farther back. This is going to give me a softer spray pattern, and I'm not using any sort of freehand shields here, so the edges are not going to be as sharp as the left eye, which is what I'm going for. You'll see that I started on the left side, which is the lower part of that upper eyelid where the eyelashes start, and extended that line out to the right where it meets with the iris and the pupil. And this area within the center of the eye is very dark. It just kind of blends all together, even into the eyelashes along to the right of it. It's just basically a solid black value. After I get the outlines or the edges painted in, then I start filling in the center like I'm doing here. And you can see how light I'm keeping everything. I'm going to slowly get darker and darker with this. I tried the best I can to paint around that specular highlight, but of course some paint got in there from the overspray, so I'm using a soft eraser to remove some paint in there, brighten it back up. For this crease above the eye, it's a little bit sharper, so I'm holding the airbrush closer to the surface here, and you'll see that I'm starting on the left side and just painting this freehand as I go along to the right. And I'm always following my graphite lines underneath. That's going to be my guide so I can follow the path of this curve correctly. I want to sharpen up the lower part of the eye just because it's a little bit too soft, so I'm using a piece of paper as a straight edge, lining it up with the bottom part, the transition between the lower eyelid and the eye, and spraying some paint in there, just a very, very light amount. Now for the eyelashes here, they're softer and out of focus, so instead of using a colored pencil or a graphite pencil, I'm going to paint these in with the airbrush. It's going to give me some softer edges. I started with a few on the left side from the base of them, a little bit wider, and then as I painted up and got to the top, I painted the line a little bit thinner just by moving the airbrush closer to the surface. I'm going to extend this darker value out to the right where the eyelashes are all kind of clumped together in this dark value. That way I map in the placement of it. And then I'll start painting in these eyelashes along the right side, doing it freehand again for some softer edges. I'm painting them a little bit thinner at the very end and then wider as they get down to the base. And while I'm doing this, you'll see me glaze a few more layers of paint down at the bottom into the eye just to help darken it a little bit more. For these creases underneath the eye, I don't want them razor sharp like the left eye, so I'm not using a shield. I'm just doing this freehand. And I start first by painting in the wider shape of these two larger creases and then applying a light glaze of this paint over the whole area to darken up some of the values. Along the top of the nose where the nasal bone meets with the frontal bone, there's a sharper edge here, so I'm using a shield to line up along the right side of the nose and spray some paint to the right. This gives me a slightly sharper edge. And then for the rest of that, you'll see that I just filled it in freehand to get that larger value in right up into where the eyebrow is going to start. So now this eye is in place, but you can obviously tell that it needs to be much darker. So what I want to do here is draw in a few of the softer highlights that I'm seeing here before adding more layers of paint to darken everything up. So I'm squinting my eyes while I'm looking at the reference photo, paying attention to where I see some areas of light just underneath the eye, and I'm using a soft eraser to lightly pull these out with just a very light amount of pressure on it. This way it doesn't add too much texture. And as long as the paint is light like this, there's not going to be too much contrast between the areas of paint that I remove and the areas of paint down on the panel. So it's just a very soft highlight that I can add in using a soft eraser. I would say that's good enough for now, so I'm going back to the airbrush and I'm adding another few layers of paint along the right side of the eye as it moves up toward the eyebrow just above it. Spraying a bit more paint at the bottom toward that crease and spraying less as I move up to where that transition is of the eyebrow. And then I'll add a bit more paint at the bottom for those creases underneath the eye. And you can see when I paint it in freehand like this, how much softer this eye looks than the left eye. And for this first layer of the eye, it probably took me about 10 minutes to do at the most. So everything is in place. Now it's time to really start darkening up the value and adding some more of the subtle details in here. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to paint the next layer, just starting again from the left side, working over to the right. And I'm using the same color here. It's just sepia. It's reduced about 50% with distilled water. And you'll see as I start spraying this next layer over the top, everything gets much darker. It's starting to look like the color black, but it's just sepia throughout this entire painting. As I'm doing this, I'm spraying a little bit more paint on the lower left-hand side of the eyebrow where it's dark, and then also focusing some more of this paint along to the right side of the eye where it's basically pure black in here. And while working in sepia over black, it definitely takes a lot more layers to build up to a really dark value, so you have to take your time with it. And along the right side, I want to get in that transition between the right side of the face and the darker hair just behind it. Now, it's a softer edge here, so I'm going to paint this in freehand. If I notice that this edge is getting a little bit too soft, I can sharpen it up later with a few different techniques, but for now, I'm just getting it in place. From here, I'm going to move up to the eyebrow, and I'm going to start on the left side by painting in a few wider lines. I'm not going for the detail like I did on the left eyebrow. Everything is going to be a bit softer in this one. I sprayed a little bit more paint at the bottom of the eyebrow where that darker shadow is. Maybe went a little bit too dark here, but we can fix that in a minute. And then I'm going to go around the eye another time, darken up a few layers that just seem a bit too light, so progressively getting darker and darker. I'm going to use that soft eraser within the eyebrow to lighten up a few of the areas that I accidentally sprayed too dark. Just a light pass over them will help bring down that value. I can also get some separation in between a few of these hairs here using that soft eraser, but I just want to keep this to a minimum, keep everything soft, not too detailed. Another few layers of paint along the right side of the eye, getting it darker and darker, and then I want to extend the outer contour on the right side of the face up as I move up into the forehead. And at this point, this eye is essentially done, but I just want to add a little bit of detail in here. So I'm using my soft eraser, working into that specular highlight, removing some paint, and then adding a very light amount of texture into the skin above the eye. I'm keeping that erasing to a minimum here, just making a quick pass, trying to pull out some light in some areas that are a bit too dark. So that's it for the first layers of both eyes. You can see we got them both painted in here. The left one is a bit sharper, and the right one's a bit softer. So now it's time to move on to the next part, which is going to be the nose. And then after I get the nose and the mouth painted in, I'm going to start adding the values in for the skin. Once I get some of those down, I'm going to come back into the left eye and the right eye, rework them again, blend everything into the portrait. For the nose, I'm going to start by painting in the nostrils first. Now for this first one, I'm going to start with a sharp edge by lining up a shield and spraying a little bit of paint down. And for the right side, which is a little bit softer, I'm going to paint it in freehand, but I still want a relatively sharp line, so I'm holding the airbrush close to the surface for the edge of it. Then once I get that contour painted in, I'll start filling in the darker values below it. So I'm holding the airbrush a little bit farther back from the surface, spraying some more paint at the top, and then as I work my way down, I'm spraying less. I'm going to do the same thing for the left side of the nostril. I'll spray in that contour first by holding the airbrush closer to the surface. Once I get that in, I'll fill in the paint to the right of it. And you may have noticed that the values are much darker within this nostril. Again, I'm using the exact same paint. All I'm doing is spraying more of it, just a thicker layer. I'm pulling a little bit farther back on the trigger to spray more paint. Once that's down, I'll fill in the rest of it, try to get an even value in here, and I'll use my eraser to clean up a little bit of the overspray just above it in the nose. Again, keep everything tidy and clean. So I'm happy with the placement of it, so I'm going to spray another layer right over the top here, darken everything up. You're going to see that it almost looks pure black, but it's still sepia. Moving along to the right nostril, I'm noticing a sharp edge along the top, so I'm going to use a shield that lines up with my drawing and spray some paint down. Once that's in place, I'll fill in the rest freehand, and I'll use another freehand shield along the right side, the ala of the nose, to spray in just a bit of a sharp line there so we get some definition to the outer contour of this nose. I'll tighten up that edge with the eraser, and then I'll use the airbrush freehand to start spraying in some of the darker values below and to the right of this nostril. There's a bit of overspray to the right of that nostril, so I'll remove it with the eraser, and then I'm going to apply a light glaze of paint within the two nostrils in this area called the columella. I want some darker values in there because this part of the nose is facing away from the light source, so as I darken it up, it's going to create the illusion that this is in shadow. For the right side of the nose, there's a very slight darker shadow in here, so I'll use another freehand shield to line up with my drawing and spray on the lightest amount of paint possible. I don't want this to get too dark because some of this is actually going to blend into the skin textures around it later on, so just a light layer for now so I don't lose the placement of this edge. For the left ala of the nose, we have a sharper edge, so I'm going to use a semicircle from one of these freehand shields to line up and spray a very light amount of paint down to give that sharper edge in there. It's like a very small cast shadow within this area. And I only use that shield for a small part of this. The rest I'm going to paint in freehand. This is going to give me the darker values and a slightly softer edge. And I take my time as I paint these in. I spray a little bit, and I just kind of step back from the painting a few feet, take a look at what I see, and then adjust it as needed. And so at this point, both nostrils are painted in. I have the edges of the nose in place, so it's time to start darkening up the values. I'm glazing more paint along the lower part of this nose, rounding it away from the light source. And the major light source in this painting is above and to the left. One of the easiest ways to always spot that, especially in a portrait, is to look at the reflection, the specular highlight within the eyes. You'll notice that it's just above and to the left. I used a shield to paint the nasolabial fold, which is that crease to the left of the nose. Very light for now. We're going to darken this up later, blend it into the rest of the portrait. And there's also this small crease just below the nostrils, so I used the same technique. I lined up a shield, sprayed a light amount of paint to get the edge painted in. Now at this point, I have some of the values painted in along the lower part of the nose, but it obviously needs to be much darker. So this is the time where I'm going to add some texture with my eraser. I'm going to do this while it's light, just like what I talked about earlier, so I don't get too much contrast in here as I erase out paint. I'm starting on the left side of the nose, erasing in small circular motions, and I'm always paying attention to my reference, trying to notice where I see some of the lighter areas, where some light is hitting this side of the nose. And when I remove paint like I'm doing here, I'm trying to remove masses of it, so larger areas of light, so it doesn't look like too much texture is being built up. We can add that later if we need to. And you'll see that once I remove some of that paint, I go back to the airbrush and glaze on another thin layer of sepia, focusing a bit more into the shadows and a bit less into the highlights. But I do spray a light amount of this paint into the highlights as well. It helps kind of knock down some of that texture and smooth everything out. And so now that nose is done, just like the eyes. That's the first layer of them. We're going to move on to the next part of the portrait, start painting in the mouth. For this portrait, I'm using a slightly different technique than I normally do. What I'm trying to do with this one is paint the individual parts like 80-90% of the way there. And of course, trying to keep the values a little bit lighter within these areas. And then once I get all these major features in and I add in the skin texture, then I'm going to come back and repaint everything again. That way at the end, I can add in some of the final textures and some of the darkest values that I need to. So for the mouth, the first thing I'm going to do is paint in this dark value right in the center. We're going to use this to paint in the teeth. And the way that I'm going to paint the teeth is by actually not painting them at all. And I know that sounds strange, but you're going to see what I mean in a second. So the first thing that I'm doing here is painting in this sharp transition on the lower lip to the dark value above it. And you'll see that I'm using a freehand shield with a curve in it. Now it's not a stencil, so it doesn't fit this curve perfectly. So what you'll see me doing here is moving different parts of this shield to fit the curve accurately, and then I spray some paint up. If I take my time, spray this in lightly, I can get a pretty seamless curve for this transition of the lower lip. Once that's in place, I'll start spraying the rest in freehand, and I'll spray around this little gap here where there's some light hitting the tongue. I want to keep that soft so it looks like it's out of focus in there. Now, as I move up to the teeth, the way that I'm going to paint these in is just by painting in the surrounding values. For the transition at the bottom, you can see that I'm using a few different freehand shields, lining it up and spraying a little bit of paint down. This is kind of a slow process though, and it's kind of tricky to get them right. If I take my time with this technique will still work, but there's always going to be some overspray that I have to keep cleaning up on the teeth. So an easier way to do this is to use some frisket film, and that's what I'm going to do here. I cut out a small rectangular shape of that film, and I'm just going to place it right on my panel. Now what I'm going to do instead of cutting into it is trace my lines using a black colored pencil. And now instead of cutting it on the panel or the canvas, I can take this over to a cutting board, use an X-Acto blade, and cut out these shapes. And that's going to give me a stencil for the teeth. So that's exactly what I did. I placed this onto a cutting mat, cut out the shapes with an X-Acto blade, really taking my time to get these in accurately. So I did that off camera, and now I'm going to use small parts of this stencil to line up with the teeth, spray in some paint, and then I lift it up to take a look at what my paintings are looking like. And I can use my finger like I'm doing here to prevent some overspray getting to the right. Now for the lower part of this lip, I can use the other part of that stencil to line up again and spray some paint up. The right side of the mouth gets a little bit softer, so I'm going to spray in that edge where the lip wraps around the teeth, doing that freehand to give a bit of a softer edge in there. And then I'll line up that stencil again, spray some paint down, and then I'll just come around with my eraser to clean up any little bits of overspray that I missed before. For the right side of the teeth, they get a little bit softer, a bit more out of focus, so I'm painting in that edge freehand and extending it into the darker value within the mouth. That frisket film will give me a much sharper edge here, which is not what I want. I want to keep it a little bit softer, so I'm using freehand techniques. I know that it looks kind of strange at this point, but we're getting there. We're slowly building up the layers. So from here, I'm going to start painting in the gum line. Now I used a shield along the lower part of that top lip to spray in that sharper transition. And I noticed that the transition between the teeth and the gums are a bit softer. So I'm going to do this freehand. I'm just working along the edge first and then spraying in the darker values above it. The left-hand side of this upper lip has a dark, sharper value. So I used a shield to start the first layer of it, get that sharper edge in. And then once that edge is in place, I can spray more layers of this paint freehand over the top, which I'll do later on to help darken everything. But that edge is set for now. Now from here, I'm going to work left to right, painting in this gum line, and the sharper edge that I'm seeing here is on the transition between the gums and the lip just above it. So I use a shield to paint that in and spray some paint down. And some of the values here, especially along the left side of the gums, are going to be very dark, but you can see just like always how light I'm keeping everything now, just so I can get everything in place. Once I'm comfortable with that and I'm happy with the placement, I'll go darker later on. Along the right side of the gums, the darker value is above on the lower part of the lip. So I'm using a shield again to line up, and this time I'm spraying the paint up into the lip rather than into the gums. I'll use my eraser to clean up some overspray from the teeth and help sharpen up the edges along the transition between the teeth and the gums, and then I'll use the airbrush freehand to spray in the rest along the right side. And all I'm doing is following my pencil lines, trying to keep this paint above the teeth just to get in those lighter values of the gums. Now I'm going to come around with my airbrush and darken up some of the values, clean up a few of these edges, and you can see that we got the teeth painted in without actually painting them at all. We just painted in the surrounding areas. You can see in my completed painting on the left side of the screen that there are a few very subtle highlights within these teeth, and we're going to get to that at the end of the painting. I'm going to glaze a very light amount of sepia over the teeth and then use my eraser to pull out those subtle highlights. Now these teeth are going to look a lot brighter once we start painting in the surrounding values like the upper lip, the lower lip, the surrounding skin textures. We're going to get to that a little bit later. But one thing that I noticed is that there are a few specular highlights on the gums, so I'm going to use an aggressive eraser here and just pull out a few little dots of paint to make it look like some light is hitting the top part of the gums. So let's move along to that lower lip. The first thing that I'm doing here is applying a very light amount of paint along the bottom of it where it starts rounding over into shadow. I'll paint in this thin crease within the middle of the lip, glaze another layer of paint along the bottom, and then pull out a very thin highlight just below that crease that I painted in. Now that I have this base layer of this upper lip in place, I'm going to move along to the left side of the gums where they need to be a much darker value. Now they need to be dark, but it's not a single value in here. There's some transitions going on, so I'm just paying attention to my reference photo, trying to notice where it shifts from light to dark. You can see like there's that darker value within the center of the gums. I sprayed in some more paint there, and I sprayed less as it gets a little bit lighter over to the left and to the right of it. And the darkest value in the gums here is along the top between the transition of the gums and the lip just above it. I want to get the right side of the lip painted in, so I'm going to start at the bottom where it's darkest, add some more paint there, and then I'm going to work on the contour along the top. It's a softer edge up there, so I start by painting it in freehand, and then I'm going to fill in an even value within the lips. The freehand was just a bit too soft, so I used a shield to line it up, sprayed some paint to the left, and then I'm going to use my eraser to refine it a little bit more. I can sharpen it up, clean up the edges. You may notice that the teeth now look a lot brighter than they did before because we got some of that surrounding value painted in. If you want something to look bright in a painting, you always need dark value surrounding it. There's some texture in this lip, especially along the left side. There's a few thin bands of light here, so I'm going to use my aggressive eraser and just start drawing them in. Because these lines are so thin, I need a sharp point on that eraser to draw them in accurately, so I use an electric pencil sharpener, and then I clean up the edge using a piece of sandpaper. This way I get a very sharp point at the end of my eraser, and it makes it so much easier to draw in thin lines like this. I'll continue to draw these in, and while I'm doing this, you'll see me switch off between the hard eraser and the soft eraser. I can use the softer one to go over some of the larger areas within the lips to help lighten everything so there's not too much contrast between the brights and the darks. And then finally, I'll glaze another thin layer of paint along the lower part of this upper lip to help round this part away from the light. The final part I need to paint in is this lower lip, so the first thing I'm going to do here is paint in this darker shadow at the bottom, and I'll start by doing that freehand to get it in place. And then for the left-hand side, I'm going to spray over a freehand shield to get a sharper edge in there, start filling in the center, and as I move to the right, it's a bit softer, so I'll paint it in freehand. For a few of the creases in the lips, I use that shield to lightly spray over to get a very subtle shadow in here. And then I'll continue with the airbrush, spraying some darker values along the edges and then toward the bottom third of this part of the lip. And then finally, the last thing I want to do here is add in the first layer of the highlights here using a soft eraser. It's kind of like a few vertical bands and sketches of light within it. And so that's where I'm going to finish the first part of this video. We got all the major features of this portrait painted in, the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. There's still a ton of work to do and a lot of reworking and adjustments for all these parts that we just painted, but we're going to pick that up in the next video. Thank you all so much for being here and for watching this one. And of course, before I go, I want to say thank you so much to the generous support of the channel members. I want to give a shout out and a welcome to the newest channel members this week. That's Paul K, George L, and William F. Thank you guys so much and welcome. And I'd like to welcome back Anders, Sanders S, Scotty Jackson, Art, Hengel, and Ray H at a very generous tier 3. Thank you guys all so much. Welcome back. Be well, everyone. Wishing you all the best in your paintings and drawings. I'll see you back here next Friday.